Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Good morning and welcome to In the Word again. This is our third lesson in this new quarter's work on the superiority of God, the sovereignty of God. And we are in the book of Isaiah, and we've been progressing through the book, not every chapter, but from different kinds of literature. Lee, this time we're out of the apocalyptic, and but again, instead of a terrible denunciation of how bad Israel and Judah and Jerusalem are, we get a passage or a section that starts off, "Comfort ye, comfort ye, comfort ye, my people, right. Says your God, speak comfortably to Jerusalem and tell her that her problems are over. And the voice of one crying in the wilderness." Oh, very beautiful terminology and beautiful thoughts.
It's beautiful. Chapter 40 in Isaiah is the basis of a number of Handel's compositions in the beautiful oratorio Messiah.
Yes.
And so this is a magnificent chapter. It marks a real sharp turn into a new focus for Isaiah.
Yes.
We had those first 23 chapters or so, which talk a lot about the coming destruction.
Well, and the failures of Judah and Jerusalem and Israel, the northern kingdom, and
there's hope to be found there, but it's dominated by their sin and their idolatry. And it's a pretty dark beginning in many ways. And then we had that apocalyptic section we talked about last week. What we skipped over is a section in which we see Isaiah interacting with Hezekiah, who was the king at the time.
Yes, chapters 36 through 39 is actually reproduced in the book of Second Kings, I think it is.
Yeah, Second Kings.
It's
a fascinating passage.
And it's invasion by Sennacherib, and even though he exacts tribute from Hezekiah, yet his army suffers for its attack on the people of Judah and Jerusalem.
So Isaiah has lived through the destruction of the northern kingdom, and he foresees the destruction of the southern kingdom, which is still 100 years off into the future.
Well, the start of it, though, is certainly...
Yeah, the seeds are being planted already in the idolatry and the injustice of the people of the southern kingdom.
And we saw the rise of the theology of the remnant.
Right, and this is part of that future look that Isaiah has off to the horizon, in which he can see a devastating destruction that's yet to come, but a restoration of the faithful remnant.
Yes.
And it's kind of in that view off into the future that we see him talking in this section about a time of comfort and peace that God will bring for his people.
Yes, but at the same time, some warnings.
Yeah.
And one of the chief warnings is against idolatry. And that will be a sore subject for the prophets for a couple of centuries to come.
Right. And even before we get to our printed text here, there's a devastating statement about idolatry.
Yes.
He says, "To whom then will you liken God, and what likeness compare with him? An idol? A workman casts it. A goldsmith overlays it with gold and makes silver chains for it." So he mocks these. You can knock one of these things over, they'll just topple to the ground.
Well, in another place he describes, here's a block of wood. The artisan takes and carves a god out of, and the rest of it, he builds a fire and cooks his supper on.
Right.
And then he bows down and worships this thing that he's made with his own hands.
Exactly.
And isn't that kind of stupid?
Yeah. So Isaiah mocks idolatry, but at the same time he knows that even the people of Judah, who've been more faithful to Yahweh than the people of the northern kingdom were, even they are and will continue to be tempted to idolatry throughout their experience with surrounding nations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the title of this lesson is Foundations of the Earth. And I would like to propose a slightly different title for the lesson, but I think you want to defend the foundations. I would call it God, Yahweh, as creator of the universe.
Now,
because the term creator shows up in our creation.
Yeah.
Shows up in this short passage twice.
It does. Verse 26, who created all these? Verse 28, the creator of the ends of the earth. And yes, I'm not necessarily defending the title. I think it is suggestive of God as creator. But yeah, that's exactly the theme.
Yeah, but it's a little bit of a stretch to get there.
So yeah, we could call this the Lord of creation, or creator of all, or the new creation even.
Or the foundation builder.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but instead of putting our focus on the foundations, we should be putting our focus here on God.
On God, exactly.
On the nature and power of God. Remembering that our series here is sovereignty of God.
Right.
And here we see that sovereignty played out as God as Lord of all creation, but also Lord of human history.
Yes.
And so God's sovereignty.
And Lord of the future.
Yeah, true, true. Well, let me read this. It's a longer passage, but we'll start in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 21. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. He brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground than he blows on them and they wither, and a whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. To whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. Why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord. My cause is disregarded by my God. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint.
What a powerful, powerful statement. But we need to go back and focus a little bit on it. In the first place, I would remind our viewers that beginning in verse 21, there are a lot of second persons.
You.
And even verbs that are in the second person. You lift up your eyes is an imperative verb, and all of these, the subject is a masculine plural.
So it's
in other words, it's a group that's being addressed.
All people in the group. Yeah.
Yes, and that continues all the way through verse 26. But the you in verse 27 and 8 is singular masculine because it's treating the group as one whole.
And calling them Jacob and Israel as if it were a person almost.
Yeah. The interesting thing is they are being addressed as Jacob and Israel, which are the names for the olden days, like in the days of David and Solomon, where David is king of Israel and Solomon is king of Israel.
Before the division of the kingdom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is old terminology. It's harking back to the golden age of the past.
Okay.
And, okay.
Well, back to verse 21, you're talking about the you here. That's helpful. I wanted to mention that the you is the Israelite people of the southern kingdom who are still tempted to idolatry.
Precisely.
And that verse 18 and 19 of chapter 40 that I referred to earlier is the context here. So these are Jews who are tempted to worship some of the gods and goddesses of the nations with whom they come into contact.
They are a small group of people that is in a very much larger population where the belief is that there are many, many gods and goddesses, and they have to be treated and handled very carefully. That is the gods and goddesses. Right. Otherwise, they can destroy you, so you've got to be cooperative. Yeah. And the image that the prophet here is saying, listen, that's stupidity.
Yeah. Yeah, these rhetorical questions in verse 21 are very powerful. Don't you know? Haven't you heard? Hasn't anybody told you? Don't you understand? The answer to all these questions is obvious. The answer is yes.
You have been told.
You have been told. You know better.
You ought to know better.
Yeah, you have the tradition of your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You have the law, the revelation that came through the law. You know better.
Have Moses. You have David. That's your background. That's your heritage.
Yeah, and what they know about God should take them all the way back to creation, which is your point for the title of the lesson.
Exactly.
We see it even in verse 21. Has it not been told you from the beginning? That's a reminiscent of Genesis there. And since the earth was founded.
By the way, the Bible begins with that word, beginning.
Beginning, I know, yeah. And since the earth was founded. So he says, you should know better that God is sovereign and that these idols are nothing compared to God. Just think back to creation if you need to be reminded of the power of God.
Well, now we get the comparison further in verse 22 that God is distant, but he is looking down upon humans. I know all of us have been up in an airplane and or up on top of a mountain and looked down on things that are beneath us, and they look so small.
Right.
And to project that experience, human experience, into divinity, how God sees things. The things that may be going on now seem really earth-shaking and so powerful and dominating. When God looks at them, he's looking at them from the height, you might say, and they look small. And he sees not only what's now present, he knows the entire past, he sees the present, and he sees the future, and he places what we think is so big and earth-shaking into the whole picture in terms of time, and he's not particularly bothered by this. He understands that things are relative and that time will show them to the rest of us that way.
And the people that we think of as so powerful and influential
Exactly.
are like grasshoppers, or we might say ants or something like that.
But now look at verses 23 and 24. I think this is again extremely poetic, because he uses an agricultural metaphor to describe the relationship of the powerful, the mighty, the powerful, and the rich. They are like plants, trees. Now, we've all experienced tornadoes and high winds in this part of the country, and some not that long ago, and we know what wind can do. It's nothing but air.
Yep. But it can take a mighty oak tree to the ground from its roots.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that the image here is of a whirlwind, hurricane, or tornado that, what does it do to the plant world?
Yeah. And you're right, verse 24, no sooner are they planted. It's a reference back to verse 23.
Exactly.
These rulers, these powerful people, these judges, that's a term that was used of the mighty men and women of the book of Judges.
The heroes.
Yeah, people like Samson or Jephthah or Gideon.
Yes.
People like that. And the wording of verse 23 is very powerful. Brings them to naught, makes them nothing. That's the word for zero, empty, nothing, nada. Yeah, makes these people who seem so full of themselves and so powerful, renders them zeros.
And that's the way it is. I mean, where are the mighty who dominated the world? I mean, go back to Frederick the Great, or to Stalin, or Hitler, or anybody else that you can think of, who were dangerous people and who really had many of us frightened. Where are they?
Earlier in
Gone.
This, and so the temporality, the temporariness of human existence is emphasized here. I wanted to point back to another verse early in this chapter, chapter 40, verse 4. Every valley will be lifted up, every mountain and hill be brought low. This describes a beautiful image of kind of leveling. We think of the building of a
building a road.
Like the building of an interstate highway.
Yeah.
The most notable one to me is the West Virginia Turnpike, which I used to travel back when it was a 2-lane, up and down, around. And they went in and just blasted out mountains and filled in valleys, and it's still a curvy road, but...
Well, think of what we now call Interstate 26 down in Carolina.
Yeah.
They were building on that thing for years. Right. And remember that viaduct just after you cross into Carolina?
Right.
Oh, my.
It took forever.
It took forever to build that thing.
Well, so what we have here are the bringing down of the mountains and the raising up of the valleys. The first part of that image is described here in the verses we're looking at, where the high and mighty, the rulers, are brought low. Yes. And a little later in our passage, we're going to see the lifting up of the lowly.
Yes.
This is a very important theme in Isaiah, and it's going to become an important theme for Jesus, too. I'll just mention when we get to the ministry of John the Baptist and to Jesus' own ministry in the Gospels.
Well, Jesus is reflecting the Father who is the protector of the lowly.
Right.
That's the way God is always presented in the Old Testament.
Well, verse 25, as you pointed out, is in the first person. So here God suddenly speaks in agreement with the prophet.
In just one little statement.
Just one verse. To whom will you compare me? Who's my equal, says the Holy One. And then we go right back into the voice of the prophet.
Yes.
Yeah. And here's where the very direct mention of creation appears.
Yeah, it's the same word that's used in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1.
Okay. lift up your eyes and look to the heavens, which is kind of a euphemism for saying, look to God. You know,
Yes.
Think about, don't look at the rulers and the princes. They're relative nobodies. Look to God.
God is eternal.
Yeah.
And that's going to come out in verse 28.
Okay.
Just to skip ahead
Sure.
for a second. And where creator is used in the next line, the parallel line,
End of verse 28.
Yahweh is the God of infinity, is the word I would use there, because infinity implies not only space, but time. God is both everywhere, nowhere absent, but everywhere present. And there are no time limits, limitations on God. So that one term is speaking a world of truth about the nature of God. And so think back to the term created in verse 26. Now, you would think that the word create would be mostly in Genesis, in the creation accounts.
Yeah.
Well, it's there. It occurs in Genesis 9 times, but there are many more occurrences of this verb for create, the special word, in Isaiah and in Psalms.
Yeah.
Most of the occurrences, but there is one in Ecclesiastes. Remember your Creator
In the days
in
of
the
your
days
youth.
of your
Yeah,
youth.
Yeah.
And so Isaiah is very concerned about this, as is the Psalm, as are the Psalms.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, let's go back up to verse 20, latter part of verse 26. He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name, because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. We're beginning to see here some of the characteristics then of this sovereign God who sits enthroned above all nations and all kings. And one suggestion here is God's omnipotence.
Yeah, we're applying modern terminology, theological terminology to God, and I hope God is not unhappy about our doing that, but we've got to find words, and sometimes there are not enough words to express this, but omnipotence, omniscient, and omnipresent are all involved in what we're reading here.
Right. And in verse 26, we get this emphasis on God's power. That is his all-powerfulness, his omnipotence. I think his omniscience begins to be suggested in the next verse, and by omniscience I mean his all-knowing nature. Why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, my cause is disregarded by my God? The Israelites are kind of suggesting, well, God doesn't really know what I'm doing. I'm in control of my own life.
Well, it's not only that, but God doesn't see what I'm going through.
My suffering.
My suffering
Yeah.
and the attacks on me. He doesn't seem to care.
Right.
He doesn't know, and he doesn't care.
The implication here, in the opinion of Isaiah, is he knows and he cares. So that's a suggestion of God's omniscience, which I think is highlighted later on. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. God gets it. God knows what's going on.
Yes.
And you kind of suggested his omnipresence when you said that in verse 28, the Lord is the eternal God, the God of infinity. And I liked your description of that, not only of all time, but of all space as well.
Yes.
And so God is present no matter what our circumstances are.
Yeah.
And so
Psalm 139 really makes a strong case for this. There's no place, no time where you can go and find yourself where God is absent.
Yeah.
Even in the grave, God is there.
Yeah. So this is a glorious passage for the way it emphasizes so many of the characteristics of God. God's sovereignty, God's eternality, you talked about.
Yes.
God's omnipotence, God's omniscience, God's omnipresence.
Yes.
And probably others that I haven't named.
Could we make up a word for all time? Omnichronic.
Omnichronic or omnitemporal.
Okay. We've just, I hope God isn't angry with us.
Yeah, right. It's hard to describe the greatness of God with human language, isn't it?
It is.
Well, these last three verses are so beautiful. Let's take a peek at them. He gives
weary and
strength
weak
to the weary and weak. And doesn't this make a beautiful contrast to the references back in verse 23 and 4
Yes.
to the mighty?
Contrast of the mighty
Yes.
to the weak.
The mighty, the princes, the rulers, they were being brought low. In the meantime, what's happening to the weak and the weary? They're being strengthened.
Yes.
And there's the other side of that beautiful image that he gave us earlier in the chapter of the mountains being brought low and the valleys being filled up.
Well, times can be so hard that even the youths, the young people, can be tired and weary. And the young men of strength and virility will, and the expression here is a very emphatic stumble, will mightily stumble, or will totally collapse.
Yeah.
Is what is implied here in verse 30. But for those who wait for and hope in Yahweh, they will renew their strength. They will exchange weakness and weariness for strength.
Because of putting their trust and hope in God.
Yeah, and that's
not on their own doing.
Well, yeah, and the verb that's used here is kind of, they will exchange this weakness for strength.
Yeah. Well, that's a word that we talked about last week in our lesson, this word that it's kind of a mixture of hoping and waiting. And I was thinking after last week's lesson that, Jesus talked a lot about that too. In many of his parables, he talks about hoping in the return of the master, which involved waiting.
Yes.
But it was an active waiting. It was a faithful waiting, being about your task. Well,
though I remember one time saying to a Scotsman in Edinburgh, we were sitting waiting for our wives to come out of the ladies' room, and I said to him, "Those also serve who wait." And he really thought that was a wonderful thing to hear.
Well, the emphasis on God in this passage is beautiful, but also the effect of God on his people who, in spite of their circumstances and their own weariness, can put their hope and live triumphantly in him.
Here we have reversal, because the last part of the verse, they will run and not be weary, walk and not be faint. Exactly the same words out of verse 29. Exchange weakness for strength. Here we have one more chapter, one more section of the book of Isaiah to look at next week, chapter 61, I believe. And that'll wind up our discussion of these themes of the strength and power of God in the book of Isaiah. And we hope you'll return and be with us next week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.